Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be, and welcome to Distribution Strategy Group's Technology Leader Panel on Inventory Planning in Uncertain Times. I'm Jonathan Bine. I'm your host today. And in just a moment, we're going to be joined by our panelists, Greg Artunian from Epicor and Chandra Subramanian from ORS Group. But I wanted to share a couple things first. First, about today's webinar, the focus is really on looking at we've got economic fluctuations and shifting demand patterns and potentially ongoing supply chain disruptions. All of this can make it more difficult for distributors to balance their inventory levels. As you well know, carrying too much stock ties up working capital, increases costs, while too little leads to lower service levels, lower fulfillment levels, and potentially strained customer relationships. So what we're going to be looking at today is really more modern approaches on how to balance these competing priorities in of service levels and working capital. But first, I wanted to let you know about our Applied AI for Distributors 2025 conference. It's set for June 24th to the 26th in Chicago, Illinois. It's about 5 minutes from O'Hare Airport, so very easy to get to. If you want to know more about it, you can either go to appliedaifordistributors.com or you can scan the QR code that's on your screen there. To let you know what we're going to be focusing on, it's really about AI in action, really delivering real value for distributors, moving beyond the theoretical. Really important theme is how we put human intelligence and AI side by side to build the next competitive edge. And we've got about 25 different technology companies that are going to be sharing what they're doing with AI. A lot of these are AI-enabled applications. We've got a distinguished set of speakers and panelists, including Noel Russell, who was recently voted or recognized as the #1 thought leader in agentic AI. Trent Gillespie, another leading voice in the AI world from Stellus AI, used to be at Amazon. Don Sarno, SVP of Digital Enterprise at Sonopar North America. Janet Zelenka, amazing speaker we've had a couple times before, award-winning CFO, CIO, and board member. Paul Kennedy, the CEO of Dakota Supply Group. That's the other DSG. Dakota Supply Group. Tracy Duell, managing partner at CXO and CIO at Boswick Braun, and then Dina Stanton, VP Comp at Kyndryl. So we've got a really good group of people coming. Again, we'd love to see you there. We know that the folks that get on AI right now are going to reap the benefits in very material ways within this decade. At this point, I'd like to welcome Chandra Subramanian, the CEO of ORS Group, and Greg Hartunian, Director of Sales at Epicor.
Hi, Jonathan. How are you?
I'm doing great, Chandra. How are you doing?
Very good, thank you.
Hi, Jonathan.
Greg.
How are you? Good to see you again, Chandra.
Same here, Greg.
Hey, Greg. So just a note to our audience, we will be taking questions. We'll make a game time decision about whether it should be handled in the moment or perhaps deferred to a later time. I will tell you in advance, we do not take anonymous questions. So if you pose your question and you're not identified, we won't be taking that question. We've got a really rich topic here, gentlemen. And by the way, we've got a couple of the best people in the world to have this discussion right now. So I'm really excited. Let's start by talking about the impact of economic uncertainty on inventory strategy. I want to just throw out a first question. Are there warning signs that distributors can watch for that allow us to understand if we're in a period of uncertainty? And these could be macro indicators. They could be things that you see in your own data. What are the things that tell us that we're in a period of uncertainty?
You want to go first, Greg?
Sure. I always look at the data, and I think the first point is that we're always in a period of uncertainty. I think that's the biggest takeaway. So these times are typical times. Randomness and variability and uncertainty are supply chain planning facts of life. It's just there are some times that tend to be more turbulent than others. So I think obviously if we pay attention to macro, that should give us a good idea of what may be coming. But I think the early warning signs, oftentimes with macro, there's just a huge latency, months long latency before it works its way through the supply chain. So people need to pay attention to the macro, be aware that things are coming down. But with respect to the data, I think the number one thing to look at is your demand data and tracking that at least on a weekly basis. If you start to see a typical items demand history drop off, that's an indication of a potential slowdown. Is that a trend? Are you seeing multiple weeks in a row where demand is declining? Are you seeing multiple weeks in a row where supplier receipts are elongating? These are all very basic types of data analysis that companies can do to give them an indication that demand may be slowing down. And if so, not placing those replenishment orders or recalibrating your order points so that your triggers aren't set too high. That doesn't require AI either. I mean, that's just a very simple, just trend analysis or monitoring actual historical data. And there are a lot of tools out there that are available to distributors to do that. I think when you anticipate that things are going to be more uncertain or more fluid than typically, that's really the time to start paying more close attention to more granular data sets. So if I have a monthly forecasting process where every planning cycle is a month and we're reviewing our demand and we're creating forecasts on a monthly basis that are being updated, if I believe things are getting more unpredictable, I'm not certain about the economic impacts, the tariffs, how they're going to impact things. I need to adjust. I need to increase the planning cycle. I should probably go every other week or weekly now so that I have access to more detailed information to spot those short-term trends that could emerge into longer-term ones.
So, Greg, you're getting into the prescription. I want to stay with the diagnosis for just a moment. Chandra, how would you notice when we're in Greg's words, we're seeing more uncertainty or more turbulence? What are the things you would be
Yeah,
looking?
I agree with Greg. I mean, this is there's seismic shifts in the industry in general that happen every so often that kind of drives change of behavior, both on the consumer side and from an investment standpoint as well. I think COVID was one of those. We're still talking about something that happened, almost 5 years back, but you can still see the impact of behavioral change that happened because of COVID, and that is actually impacting everything from how people stock, the kind of economic impact that you're still struggling with, inflation and other stuff. The extreme amount of spending by governments from all over the world, and the impact that's going to have on generations to come. So that was a seismic shift. The other shift that happened before that was the 2008 crisis, and that caused a change in behavior. But each of these cycles, and we call them black swan events, in the theoretical academic world, but each of these events actually cause significant change to the way you manage your business. And volatility and uncertainty is what has become the norm. To Greg's point, has become the norm now, and everything you need to start thinking about, you have to look at that first. There are various techniques you can employ to do that. External market indicators, you definitely need to watch for those. And some of these indicators don't really impact you now, but they'll impact you a few months down. So it's not only important to figure out what those indicators are, but it's also important to figure out how and when and what weight does that indicator have on your business. And I think that's the biggest challenge you need to solve. And we've got techniques, obviously data is important, but all the different techniques you use from a application of models like, artificial intelligence, neural networks, and so forth are even more so important now. They weren't available a couple of decades back, they're available now. And those can really give you an indication of what that impact is, when is it going to impact you, how's it going to impact you, how's it going to impact your demand, and what's going to be the impact on capital costs and so forth. So I think the tools are available now, but the volatility in the industry, to Greg's point, this has been this is a norm now. It's been the norm since, I'm going to say, 2008.
Well, but you mentioned the black swan scenario. So isn't it by definition that black swans cannot be predicted?
Um,
Of course, you're not
yeah,
going to predict
the
that.
reason they're called black swans is because they cannot be predicted. But there's this book that was written in the 70s by a gentleman by the name of Douglas Adams called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Hmm.
It's a satire on bureaucracy, human nature, and absurdity of the universe. The central to the story is the question of the life, universe, and everything that matters. And in that book, there's an AI called Deep Thought. And every time, the characters in the book ask Deep Thought a question, the standard answer they got back was the number 42. So you ask it anything you want, and it gave you 42. The issue is that in the story, no one knew to ask the right question. And that fundamentally is the issue with your question on black swan, right? I mean, you cannot predict, but should you even be thinking about predicting black swan or a black swan event? Or should you be setting up your business to address potential black swans, right? And it's a very different approach to looking at it, right? On Wall Street, when we do portfolio management, and we invest, literally millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. We do what is called the value at risk analysis, right? What happens if the interest rate, what happens if there's a massive volatility in the markets? The interest rate goes up dramatically, or you have an event like you had in 2008 or in 2020. What does that do to your portfolio? It's an interesting approach because you're now saying systemically I'm planning for large events that I cannot predict, but I can analyze by using certain simulation techniques, using AI and such approaches, standard theoretical models that have been in play in the industry for 30, 40 years, by some of the really, very experienced Nobel Prize winners from University of Chicago. There's a lot of models that are in play, which you can apply in this industry. It's not expensive. You didn't have the data before, now you have the data. So you can apply these techniques and make these techniques fundamental to the way you're running your business. If you do that, then you don't have to worry about black swan because you know what happens when such events hit you.
So this would allow you to say, I don't know when the black swan event is happening, but here's how I would respond based on having done simulation techniques if it were to happen.
Exactly right.
Powerful. Let's also take another broad question. Let's stay with you, Chandra. How should economic volatility change the way distributors approach inventory planning? And so when I say volatility, I mean inflation, supply chain disruption, tariffs, geopolitical upheaval, et cetera.
Yeah, and all of those are real now. They're rapid. They're happening more often than they used to happen before. Economic uncertainty, inflation goes up, people stop buying because you have less discretionary spending capability. If you take building manufacturing or building manufacturing product industry, right? If people stop buying decks and people stop buying building products, your business is going to suffer. If the interest rate goes up, people stop spending. Food is essentially the only thing they're going to spend on, and the basics that you need to live with. So you have to start looking at things. For one of these clients, we actually ran a external factor analysis, and we analyzed about 2,000 different external factors that would impact the business, and we narrowed down to about uh, 70 or 80 external factors that really had an impact on the business. Obviously, inflation, interest rate, and all of those things are way up the list. But we found things like when you saw a spike in the purchasing of trucks, the
Heavy duty
four-wheel
trucks.
trucks, exactly. You
Yep.
saw that their demand went up, but it didn't go up tomorrow. You saw the spike go up in the purchasing of those trucks, and you saw the demand go up, 3 months out, right? You saw that interest rate dropped or interest rate went up in January, and you saw there's a lag. So we actually analyzed this and told them what the lag is, or what are those external factors that are going to impact your business, by how much, and what's the lag, or when is it going to impact it. But that's a powerful tool to have, because everything you do, I mean, if you're a publicly traded company, you've got to go back to the street every quarter and give them information about how your business is going to do in the next quarter. It impacts your purchasing, because once you know this and you're watching for these indicators, you see that, and that's the other important thing about forecasting. People tend to focus on accuracy of forecast. I think that's the wrong thing to focus on. The accuracy of forecast is only important if you're going to use that forecast to allocate tomorrow, next week, the week after, right? Because then you want to know how much you're going to be, selling. But if you're going to use it for the 3 to 6 month planning, then the accuracy is almost not important. What is more important is the volatility in the forecast. And once you get to understand that volatility and how you use that volatility, the range, your forecast 6 months out is going to be impacted because of this interest rate change today by 25 basis points, and it's going to impact it by this much. And there's a risk in that forecast, which is your volatility. And once you understand that, then you can start planning for that 3-6 months out. You can start, buying less, manufacturing less, whatever you do. You can start doing that now, because there's a lead time between now and when the product arrives at your store, right? These are things that you can do with AI and technology now that you were not able to do before. You have all the data. You have enormous amount of external data that you can get from the market, which you didn't have before, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that when you pick these kind of approaches, you really need to have a very strong understanding of what you're using that technique for. I mean, is it for short-term planning, mid-term, long-term planning? And then based on that and the volatility that the machine informs you, then you obviously have to use your human, your gut feel and your experiential knowledge comes into play on how to actually use that information. So that, back to your original comment about human-machine collaboration, I think that's the right way to work on now.
So when you say accuracy, you mean at the week-by-week level, not at the 6 month level. Is that right?
Well, accuracy, when you look at forecast accuracy is, is a very tricky subject, right? I mean, by the way, you cannot just forecast at a category level anymore. You have to go down to the SKU level. Okay, you have to go down to SKU and regional level. You need to know, because every SKU behaves in a different way in different parts of the country, right? In Florida, in a certain zip code, a SKU will behave very differently in a certain season than it would, in Boston, for example. So you need to start thinking about forecasting at a really granular level. Now, how you use the forecast? Are you using the forecast, and what do you use the forecast for? Are you using the forecast for planning mid to long-term manufacturing or your buy plan? Are you planning to use the forecast for taking your existing inventory and distributing it across the network effectively to meet the demands that of those different regions that you're supporting, right? Depending upon what your answer is, you either focus on the accuracy of the forecast or you focus on volatility. So when we go talk to clients and when we, kind of sit across the table with executives, the first question we get asked is, what is your forecast accuracy of your engines? And then you go through this educational process where you actually tell them wrong thing to focus on, right? You have to now basically tell us, what do you plan to use the forecast for? And then we go through the process of explaining to them that don't focus only on accuracy. Start thinking about, your stochasticity within the forecast, the range within the forecast. So that's the education that, we give every single, we have to do with every single executive or every single customer, whether it's in the retail industry, distribution, manufacturing, it doesn't matter what, but we have to educate people because, I'm sorry to say this, Jonathan, but analysts have done a really dirty job of, comparing different forecasting companies based on the accuracy that they forecast, and it's created a very bad, I'm going to say, given very bad information to executives on the wrong things to focus on or focus on to buy these kind of forecasting and just sort of look at these kind of forecasting techniques.
Yeah, if I may add, these are all really great points. The key is in times of uncertainty, that is when you need better forecasts. When times are really predictable, an average will be just fine because your range of errors around that average will be pretty tight, will be pretty small, right? So when you're getting into these more fluid situations, more randomized events that are going to happen, the ripple effects from these disruptions, that's when it's much, much more important to use AI to start predicting. And to Chandra's point about the range and what we want to focus on during these uncertain times with respect to accuracy is the difference between the accuracy and what we call the point forecast, which is the midpoint, right? Because if we think about what is a forecast is really the midpoint of many possible outcomes that could happen, right? It's essentially the middle, that midline. Think of a storm path. They'll say, hey, the landfall is going to be Miami. Well, there's a range of those landfalls. It could be north, it could be south of Miami. That's just to predict it, but there's a probability that it'll be within a certain range. So in these uncertain times, it's much more important and actually more credible to predict those ranges and then to use those ranges to make more informed decisions. And I'll give you an example. If you want, when we get into inventory planning, right? And again, forecasting at a very macro level is great, but we've got to get down to the product and product by location. And when we're getting down to those levels, those macro indicators might have an impact, but the latency is very long. The lag period may not be necessarily that predictable. And there may be other factors influencing the demand that trump the macro indicator as well, which causes things just to be, again, more uncertain down to that lower level. What we want to focus on at that level is how accurately you can predict the upper percentile. And for inventory planning, that's critical for a distributor. Like what a distributor really cares about is what percentage of the time a customer places an order, I'm going to have inventory to ship them, right? Like what percentage of the time? And the policies that they have in place, their reorder points or their MOQs, that's going to give them a certain risk of running out. And the knee-jerk focus tends to be, hey, if we forecast our demand better, we'll get our reorder points, we'll get our inventory in line. And that's just not true because, again, the forecast is the midpoint. And so there
is the problem that we're using averages, and averages can get highly skewed as opposed to percentile, medians, et cetera?
Well, yes. The biggest problem is companies use kind of mental math and averaging to come up with predictions of both demand and corresponding reorder points. The bigger problem is the lack of focus on figuring out the probabilities for demand being here, here, or here. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so if you think about a traditional forecast, even if it's using AI, like even if it's like a really quote accurate forecast, it's still a midpoint because demand has an equal probability of being above or below that forecast. And so what's really important is how accurately you can predict the upper probabilities, because that's what's critical for inventory planning. What's the number I need to cover demand 95% of the time or 99% of the time? That's what I need as a distributor. Because if I just inventory my forecast and I only inventory my forecast, guess what? Even in predictable times, you're going to have stockouts half the time, right?
Yeah, well
Because
said, Greg.
yeah. So, but now you get to the volatile times, and that range of uncertainty went from this to this, right? So and to echo Chandra's points about the macro indicators and how that's impacting a lot of things, the beauty of look, we talk about ERP and like the data you have in your ERP, you have your sales data, you have your shipment data, you have your usage data. Like that's really valuable information. And it's hard, without a really comprehensive analysis that Chandra is focusing on, to tie these to economic indicators in a actionable way to optimize a reorder point, as an example. But it's okay because those indicators have, over time, the past uncertainties and the past impacts have made their way into the demand patterns, right? And if we can simulate those demand patterns thousands and thousands of times, that's what AI will allow you to do. There's a lot of probabilistic based techniques that can simulate demand many thousands of times. We can then use those simulations to create accurate ranges. And if we create an accurate range, as a distributor, we then just need to decide how much are we willing to pay to cover a certain percentage of that range. And then we don't care what the prediction of demand is, because we know the actual isn't going to be that prediction. It'll be above it, it'll be below it. What we're really protecting against is the percentage of the time I'm unwilling to run out.
How much insurance do I want to buy?
Just to add
Bingo.
just to add to what Greg said, I mean, that's really well put, Greg. A couple of other things that you can overlay on a model like that is how much of the demand you want to capture. I mean, right. You could have a demand for 90 units, but you want to capture only 70. And how do you decide that? Or how much money you're willing to allocate? So you overlay some capital allocation models on that model that Greg just explained, and you can run things like a scenario. You can run scenarios to allow you to decide that if you capture 80% of the forecasted demand with the money you have, your probability of loss could be within a range that's acceptable to you. So there's a lot of other techniques that you can do. Value at risk modeling is one such technique. Monte Carlo simulation is another such technique. You can run these techniques to actually make this whole process scientific. Now, despite that, science behind it, the one thing that many of these models miss is a human element of it, because you're in business. You meet with your customers on a daily basis. You're walking the corridors. You're walking the street. That subjective information needs to be added back into all of these processes. And at ORS, we've always done that. We've always said, your business more than any model can know its business, your business, right? So the models spit out indicators. You make the decision, right? Because your decision is actually going to make or break your company. So all the subjective information that you have, information about the new competitors come to play in a certain region, right? The model's never going to know that. It's not in the data. It can never be in the data. You can bring external data in, but it's still not going to have it. But you know it. And that's going to have an impact on your demand. So we now need to capture those subjective, information that the company has into these models. And there are techniques that you can deploy to use that effectively. So now you have a really robust scientific approach to forecasting. You're overlaying that with some economic models, and you're overlaying that with subjective information that's coming from the market and from your staff. And then you suddenly have a plan there that you can bank on, right? So that's I think is if we take this approach, you can deal with volatility, short-term, mid-term, and long-term volatility.
Let's shift now to, if we look at this problem. So Greg, you said a great piece there. The prior models can generate an average, AI can generate an average. The AI thing might be better. Same thing with the ranges. Let's talk about what it is that you can do with AI now in getting better information around forecasting than you could prior to AI. Maybe let's start with you, Greg.
Well, the number one thing we've done at Epicor is simulating a probability for each possible outcome. And I think that's the real critical piece. Like in times of uncertainty, our approach is to combat that uncertainty using uncertainty, right? In other words, we don't know what the future will hold. There could be random spikes. There will be random spikes. We just don't know when and what that effect will be. We should then use the rich set of historical data that we have as a foundation to simulate from, using techniques like Chandra mentioned, like Monte Carlo simulation, bootstrapping. There's other things called Markov chains and things like that. But the simple explanation is, imagine you can simulate what the number of possibilities are and what the probability for each possibility happens to be. Because if we can do that, then the future outcomes are no longer a guess. You can literally see a scatter plot of all of the outcomes that could happen. And you can see the extreme outcomes and what those values are. And those extreme outcomes are what you're really protecting against, ultimately. And you can decide with AI what that future probabilities for each possibility looks like on an individual item level, on a group level, an item by customer level, and then you can mitigate risk accordingly. And mitigate risk can come in one of two ways. It can be, I want to mitigate stockout risk. So therefore, I have to cover the upper tail of those simulations, right? I have to cover the longest part of that tail because I never want to run out. But now I'm creating risk on the other side, which is excess and obsolescence. So what AI can actually then do is help inform the trade-off. So in other words, do I want to cover 99% of the possible demands that might happen? If I do, I might never stock out, but now I'm going to have excess and obsolescence risk. And so what am I going to spend in excess and obsolescence risk in exchange to minimize my shortage risk? And is the benefit worth the cost, right? Am I getting the proper benefit given the investment? And vice versa. I may find that it's better to take more stock out risk because my inventory cost savings and obsolescence risk is materially lower. And so AI can help inform and actually can prescribe which sets of policies will yield the lowest total costs, considering both of those risks. Because we often talk about, like, Chandra, you mentioned it, what percentage of the demand do you want to cover? And as well as I do, if we ask that question at the first response from any business would be like, all of it. We never want to run out. We never want to run out. Well, that's true. You may never want to run out, but there's a very steep, expensive albatross of a cost that will come from never running out. And that's a ton of excess. The question really is, where are you willing to accept risk? And how much are you willing to pay to reduce that risk? And what are you going to pay in excess costs to reduce that stockout risk? And there's a balance. And the AI can provide prescriptive recommendations of what the levels of inventory need to be to give you the risk that you're willing to accept and the policies that yield the lowest total cost. And it's based on a foundation of those simulations, right? Because if we're properly simulating a probability for each possibility, we are actually now in a physical position to actually predict what our future metrics will be. So we can say, given a certain design, and a design for inventory may be a min and a max, or a reorder point and a reorder quantity, or I'm going to order a month's worth of supply every 15 days. I'm going to order, another 15 days worth, whatever it might be. That's a design. The question is, how will that design hold up against all the random demands that could occur? Right? That's the question that AI can answer, so that we can then pinpoint where the weaknesses in that design happen to be. And then we can proactively fix it before it becomes a problem. And I think that's really, and the beauty of that is you're reliant on the data that is in the ERP that's being collected without really you don't have to curate it. It's just, what did you sell to whom and when? What did you ship to whom and when? What did you use and when? And what did you receive from who and when? Your supplier receipts. That information is very valuable.
Well said, Greg. It's exactly right. And the few other things that I'd like to add to this is the data from the ERP, a lot of external data that comes in from the industry. There's a few other things that we have so we kind of work off of all of that data that comes in from ERP and external data that we collect by industry, which we curate, which is an intellectual property that my firm has, which we have been accumulating for many, many years. Financial data, economic data, socioeconomic data, and so forth. Right, nicely curated, managed, delivered into models that have been trained on that data, so that it can do rapid deployment. But to Greg's point, right, even the things like lead time, right? You have a contracted lead time, but your actual lead time's never going to be the same as a contracted lead time. So AI, we actually, as a standard practice, stick into our inventory optimizer models, a bunch of learning models, and a bunch of other models that are actually looking at all of these factors that you think you control, but you actually don't. And we always give, two scenarios, at a basic minimum. One is, what is the inventory requirements to meet the demand, given the contracted, for example, contracted lead time, and what we think is the actual lead time based on our forecast, and how that is going to impact inventory. So for all these uncontrollable factors, the AI engines are constantly running, taking all of this data, crunching the information, and providing those indicators into our inventory optimizers, which have in them self-learning tools that learn the nuances of your business and the environment around it as it runs in a single day. And that information is provided back into ERP tools, into planning systems, and it makes those tools and systems it's an additive solution. These are engines that are actually additive to your existing investments. So that's another important thing from a technology standpoint you need to look at. People tend to think about AI and say, okay, we need AI separate. You don't. AI needs to help improve all the investments you made in the organization, and needs to make your existing infrastructure, existing process more data-driven, more decision-driven. So that's the approach that we take, where we provide our clients ability to consume all these different techniques that we bring to bear, but to add value to an existing infrastructure that you've already built over a period of time, so you can rapidly get ROI out of it.
Chandra, I'm going to ask you, Greg, this as well. When you're doing the simulation, how many simulations might be done at a time?
That's a really hard question to answer. Depending upon the use case, we could run a few thousand, and it could go to a few 100,000. Okay. Depending upon the size of the business, the kind of problem we're trying to solve, it can be a few thousands to a few 100,000s, and it has to run pretty rapidly. So you also have other real constraints. For example, how much you want to spend in your compute power. Obviously, the more simulations you run, the higher your compute power or compute cost is going to be. So there's a lot of factors that play into this, into this decision, Jonathan.
Yeah, and the big thing here is, like, if you did a simulation on what would come up heads or tails, you'd probably need to flip a coin, what, 30, 40 times to get an even 50-50 distribution, maybe 50 times, right? So to kind of make the point, it's the size of the problem, the complexity of the problem is going to dictate how many simulations you physically need to run, right? So if I'm trying to simulate what the lead time demand is going to be for a given part, and I have, let's say 60 months of historical actuals, I may only need to do, 1,000 simulations on that to get a set of answers that eliminate all of the noise, right? But if I'm dealing with daily demand over that 6-year time frame, and I'm simulating what the demand might be at random on any given day, right, accounting for day of the week seasonality, week of the month seasonality, then I'm going to have to run a lot more than 600, because now if I do daily demand and I have multiple years of history, 5 years of history, I've got essentially
365 times,
yeah, 20, 30 times the data, right?
Right.
So I have to run 30 times the number of simulations. So typically at Epicor, when we run our simulation of the demands and lead times, we're using business data. Business data is usually bucketed weekly or monthly. It's like your demands or your lead times. And we're running anywhere from several thousand to 10,000 or more demand simulations. And when you get down to daily demand, we can be running anywhere from 25 to 100,000 simulations. And again, the reason why we do a lot of simulation is so if we did 2 simulations, right, what does that tell you? It doesn't tell you anything, right? We have one random spike and not. When you do a lot of simulations, you eliminate the noise and you get a realistic set of potential outcomes. And then you can forecast things like what percentage of the time out of those 10,000 simulated demands did the demand over the simulated lead time, which could be a varying lead time, breach the reorder point, right? Now I can actually test the reorder point that I've put in place is going to stock out X% of the time. And I can also show what the magnitude of the stock out was on average. Now I know. Like, that's the beauty of this, is you don't have to wait for a problem to emerge in order to proactively correct things.
That's right.
So thousands of simulations. If you're doing, and that is, I guess it's a good rule of thumb is if you ask this question and someone's doing a couple hundred simulations, that's you should ask, well, how complicated is what I'm trying to simulate? And how many data points am I looking at?
Yeah, and just so so everyone understands what simulations, right? I mean, if you look at a forecast curve and you're looking at a range-based forecast, for every point in the range, depending upon what number you pick, the following time period, the number changes. So you're actually taking every point and tracing that point all the way out into whatever time frame you're looking at from a forecasting standpoint. And for every single point, you're going to be testing out the, simulating the impact of that decision that you made, right, at that point on all future timelines. So it's a pretty, to Greg's point, it has to be in the thousands. It cannot be in the few hundreds,
right?
For sure. And
it's
in
a
many
probability
cases,
distribution of every point. Probability.
Exactly.
Think of it as a probability distribution of every point in the future.
Exactly right. And and
So
in
suffice
some
it to
cases,
say,
into hundreds of thousands.
So suffice it to say, this is going to take a little bit of compute power, right?
It's going to take compute power, but there are techniques that we use where you can actually draw the compute power. So, just to geek out a little bit, right? You can run many of these simulations in parallel. Okay, so now you got to figure out how to set up and this is where the experiential knowledge of modeling comes into play, right? I mean, there are open source tools available that you can use for setting up simulation. If you have a data science team and all that, only the large players will have the ability to invest in those data science teams. But if you're sufficiently technical, sufficiently statistical, mathematical oriented, you can actually set this up. But the experiential information comes to play on how you cannot run a simulation and then go away for 9 hours and come back and look at the results. And you'll never be able to run any meaningful amount of, analysis on, setting something like that up. It has to run in minutes to effectively look at what's coming off it and then making a decision, adjusting it, and running the simulation again. So there are some parallelization techniques that you can use for setting up your models to execute faster. You can do data segmentation. You can do architectural segmentation. You can leave stuff in memory, and you have to decide how much because it can get expensive. And we've started testing out GPU chips where from NVIDIA and so forth, where we can actually see if we can set the machine up for running more effective because those chips, they execute much faster. So there are various techniques you can use. The good news for a lot of these smaller distributors, I mean, the big ones can afford it, but the good news for smaller distributors is it's not expensive. Okay, once you know and you work with people who have done this many times, you really don't have to spend a lot of time, effort, and money in taking advantage of all of that, all of those tools that has already been set up. So this is now available. The other thing about AI, right? There's a question I think from RP there. The thing about AI is that you don't have to think, you don't have to feel the need to spend a lot of money to effectively consume AI now. I'm sure Greg can speak to that, and he'll agree with me on that. It is available for a few dollars. It's not, you don't have to spend millions of dollars or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in this. That's the other thing. So smaller distributors are actually will be able to use this as effectively as large. So the key thing you need to figure out is how do you evaluate the firm that you're working with and their experiential knowledge, instead of working with a rookie where you land up wasting a lot of money on experiments that they would do at your cost, at your dollars, instead of that working with people with companies with experience on doing something like this, and then you can really afford to make use of this technology, these kind of technologies, to run your business better.
So I think you and I could geek out for a long time here, Chandra. This is great stuff. Let's shift to talking about really how we balance all this in terms of a lot of distributors in more normal times, less turbulent times, aspire to something like a just in time, but perhaps in this period of volatility, more like a just in case model might make more sense. Greg, could you lead us off on that?
Yeah, I think it's a great discussion. Just in time, just in case. And, ultimately that's a business decision, but it's in reality, a just in case model ensures that you're in control of your own destiny, right? It may mean that you absorb more inventory costs, but the more you hold, the more you can ship to your customers and the more buffer you have when the supply chain disruptions come. That isn't to say you should be, holding months and months worth of inventory, but I think, over the years prior to, the supply chain disruptions that we had, in the last, few years and prior to COVID, taught us that we can't really rely on all the interconnected links of the supply chain all of the time. And the just-in-time model, I do think, is one that is applicable for certain types of businesses, the sorts of businesses that have significant control over their supplier base, right? That have that large buying ability, and they can dictate, because it's not really just in time. Like, it's for the company buying the inventory, it may be just in time, but for their suppliers, it's not, right? For their suppliers, they've got to hold a lot of inventory in order to give it to you just in time. So somebody somewhere in the supply chain is bearing that burden of the extra cost. So what I really want to encourage people to think about is, when we decide we want to be lean or, just in time, we want to really define what that means. So what percentage of the time Do you want to be able to ship from available stock? And what percentage of the time can you afford to not ship from available stock? And that may be different on different items. So, if we stay away from just in time or just in case, the question is how just in case you want to be, or how just in time do you want to be? And that can get determined based on, you've mentioned it earlier in the conversation, service level. And so what we want companies to start adhering to is a service level driven methodology where they define for each item or each group of items what sort of stock out risk in the form of a service level or the inverse service level, what percentage of the time do they want to fill inventory from the shelf? And if you need to do that 90% of the time, well, then there's an exact amount of inventory that you need to maintain in order to give you that 90% chance. So if just in case means that you're filling 90% of the demand from the shelf, great. If that means for another line item or group of items, it's 95%, great. But start to embrace that metric and start to plan your inventory according to achieving those metrics. And that doesn't mean that you measure after the fact. It means that you use AI to predict how your existing design is forecasted to perform. And what businesses find when they do that is on some items, they're way too lean. And on some items, they're way too thick. And then they can proactively correct that by changing the policies and letting the inventory adjust to its new equilibrium over time. I think in times of uncertainty, businesses really need to start embracing more of a just in case model, because you're not going to be able to depend on that. But to do just in case right, you need an ability to predict the outcomes and all of the possible outcomes so that you can come up with the just right amount of just in case.
Beautiful. Chandra.
Yeah, I agree with all that Greg just said. The approach to marking specific numbers against things like minimum order quantity and order levels and so forth is what causes a lot of issue, because you kind of blindly go and purchase when the stock goes below a certain amount. And we have the ability now to take all of those variabilities and model them. And once you model them, then you don't need to now worry about setting static numbers and hoping that those numbers that you're setting would actually make sense. Those are no more gut feel numbers, but actually science-backed, math-driven numbers that will change based on time of day, month, seasonality, changes based on external factors. So now you're actually looking at all of these numbers, and then you're backtesting. One of the important things you need to continue to do is backtest. Backtest your decisions to make sure that they're robust enough, right? So and all of this again is available. It's easy. It's all packaged. So you're not building for every single scenario, right? For the distribution industry, our mission really is to figure out how to take all these variabilities off your business, for a distributor. So you run your business well, and we'll, give you all the indicators using all the, experiential knowledge we have and using these kind of techniques. The other important factor, most people miss out is you're not a business because you need to make money, right? At the end of the day, your profits are important. So everything that you do on the inventory side, which is, your big, cost of capital, is going to impact any decision you make. That is going to impact everything in the organization. It's going to impact your borrowing costs. It's going to impact, it's going to impact, your debt capital that's sitting there in inventory that is not, it's not moving fast enough. So some of the factors like service levels, of course, a factor, but what kind of industry standard inventory turn ratio that you need to establish and you need to chase? What are the benchmark? And some of those factors also need to come into play when you're making these decisions. What is your borrowing cost, today? How can you reduce the borrowing cost? How can you free up free up cash flow? What would be your ideal cash conversion cycle? And these are important factors that you can actually use in the models as constraints to deliver better business outcomes. So it's not just about how much inventory to buy and how much service level to meet. You have a contracted service level with a client, but that's an arbitrary number that a client could decide. And from your standpoint, just chasing that number may result in heavy losses. And we've seen companies go bankrupt because of how they manage that relationship with a client. So you can also test some of those, and come time for renewal, you can actually have a very informed, numbers-based decision with your client on why that service level doesn't make any sense, right? So there's a lot of analytics that comes out of these kind of tools that you can use to run your business more effectively.
I want to close with perhaps a briefer answer to one question. It's a really good question. The question is for consumables, meaning MRO or safety. What guidance do you have on the average in-stock fill rate for industrial buyers?
I don't know. Yeah, it's
A
hard.
very specific question. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what I generally see with companies, not specifically answering this question, Jonathan, is it's important to decide as a business what is the level of stock out pain you will incur for not shipping something from the shelf. And if it's a consumable, presumably you use it more often, and presumably your customer can get it elsewhere, which presumably means a back order equals a lost sale. So therefore the pain is in all probability higher. So you should be targeting a higher service level, on those sorts of items, given the stock out pain. And so this kind of gets to like ABC classifications and things like that. But for stratifying a distributor's inventory for purposes of inventory management, it's often more helpful to do it based on essentially the stock out pain and the availability of supply, right? And the less likely you are to get replenished, the higher that stock out pain is, and obviously the more important the item is, the higher the service level you need. So I know that probably didn't answer the question, but maybe it gave some direction on how to go about answering it for that company's business.
Well, if you guys are unable to answer it, it means it's a hard question. So fair enough.
If I get handle on the data, I may be able to get better insights, but it's a very broad question. So, we need to kind of understand the actual pain behind the symptom that I'm reading within that question. And like Greg said, there's a lot of different approaches you can take.
Mike, who asked the question, if you want to be in touch with either Chandra or Greg after the call, let me know. I'll give you coordinates for them, and you can connect directly. Wanted to mention a new program we've got coming up, which is called AI News and Gurus. And it's going to be hosted going forward by Brian Hopkins, our COO, who's an absolute whiz on the use of LLMs and Gen AI. I wish he could be at the conference, by the way, because he's got so much to share. And then Brooks Hamilton has done a number of AI presentations for us, both at the conferences and in webcasts. So this will be an ongoing show. We'll typically be featuring one success story, one case story in each episode, along with news and other things that's happening with AI. That will occur 2 weeks from today, same time, same channel. Look for the invitation to that. And thank you to both Chandra and Greg and Chandra, for a terrific discussion. We look forward to seeing you in future panels.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chandra.
All right, Greg. Thank you.